Should I close blue? Okay. Should I close? See, going now. Okay, why is it not?
Alrighty, good luck.
Okay, go and listen.
Yeah.
Okay, close the door. Hi everyone. I'm trying to just make sure that Ambika can join us as a speaker. Just give me 1 minute. Thanks for being here. Oh, there we are. Hi.
Yes. Hi.
Hi, excellent. You
I
can hear
figured
me,
it out
right?
and joined. Yes, I can hear you very well. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well also. Just 1 second. Okay.
Great.
Okay. Hi. I think if you don't mind, we'll just give it like another minute and just let a few more people join and then we can start.
Right. I can see my team joining in.
Excellent. Yeah, so down here you'll see people as they come in. And then
But we're not live now, are we?
we are live now.
Oh, we are. They can hear us talking.
They can,
Right.
yes. Hello, everyone.
Okay. And yes, more people I know.
I've just been skimming the report again, just to make sure
Ah,
I have all the facts.
great. Yes. I'm always impressed when, people have actually read it, which is why Riza's piece, when I read her piece and I
Yeah.
tweeted, I said, excellent, please read.
Right.
It's because I could see from her piece that she'd read the report.
Right.
Right. And she's,
Yes. Yes.
So I was like,
And that's so rare somehow.
yes, absolutely. Even when it's 30 pages, but here it was like, 860
No, of course.
pages. So I was
Exactly.
like super, super impressed.
Yes, exactly. Oh, I haven't seen this piece. Is it in Himal?
No, she has, I think, like a new blog site or a newsletter. I can send it to you.
Oh, nice.
So,
Okay, that'd be great. I haven't actually read her piece. That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, someone sent it to me, so I tweeted it and said, "Oh, please, everyone
Nice.
read it. It's a good piece." And what she does is she looks at Mahara and she places Mahara in the context of the systemic issues identified in the report. So it's very good.
Excellent. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Like
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting timing for the report to finally be out and readable. Was that somehow like a last push? Was it around what happened, or maybe that's a conversation for another time?
Indeed. But actually, over I think the past 12 months, what we have found is that so many things have happened, and at each point we felt, oh, if only the report was out, it would be so useful.
Yeah.
So many things have happened, I think, more than ever in the past 12 months in relation to prisons. So I think, yes. And as I say, this is like my motto. In human rights work, there is no nakata. The nakata is now.
Yes.
Now is the auspicious time. There is no auspicious time.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you're not ever going to get any less flack for it or anything like that anyway. So it might as well be as useful as possible, of course.
Absolutely. And I think what people often forget in human rights work is that comes with the territory, getting flack, being attacked, being questioned, that comes with the territory. So we really shouldn't be afraid of that. And if we were, I think we would be less effective. We must be strategic in how we present it, but the fear of being attacked or getting flack really should not deter us from just putting it out there.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. Okay, so I think we're like 6:05 now, so I think we can sort of start officially. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. We've kind of not done an Instagram live in, I think, several months. I think at the sort of beginning of the lockdown period, we had some sessions which were really nice, and we had a really great discussion, and we had great audiences each time. So we thought it was a really good opportunity to kind of revive our Instagram live sessions. So I'll just give a quick intro to a collective for feminist conversations, and then I'll invite Ambika to just introduce herself, which we prefer to let people introduce themselves rather than kind of read these state biographies or whatever, especially since the people are always so much more exciting than can be described through a bio or whatever. So a collective for feminist conversations is really just an informal collective that some of us began, I think in 2016 now. And we are just a space where we facilitate intersectional and intergenerational feminist dialogue for all people who, have feminist values, are interested in questions that concern feminists, and so on. So it's really great to see so many of our kind of friends and audience here. Ambika, over to you. Would you like to just say a few words about yourself?
About myself? Well, I suppose a feminist, lawyer, human rights activist. I was a member of the Human Rights Commission for about 5 years. And it was during that time that I was privileged enough to work on this study. Along with actually many of my team who I see are joining us now.
Great, that's excellent news. So just to give folks a very quick overview of what we're doing today, and then we can just start with the discussion. So as some of you may have already seen, the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka just recently published this kind of very landmark report on prisons in Sri Lanka, and it just recently came out, though the Human Rights Commission has of course been working on it for many years, like Ambika just said. And many people are involved. If you kind of scroll right to the bottom to the acknowledgements, which I always personally, that's kind of almost the place that I go to. I love the reading acknowledgements because I think it tells you so much about a process. Absolutely. It tells you so much about the people and about the sort of the integrity of the report. So I think you'll see a really amazing long list of, I think, many, many different kinds of people who had to work together to, make this happen. And I do believe it's the first of its kind. Am I right, Ambika? Is this the first time that anyone has really looked at prisons through a human rights lens here?
In Sri Lanka, yes, this I think is the first ever national study of prisons. And also, if you look at even globally, I mean, many of my colleagues working on the same issue in other countries have been really excited for this report, because even globally, I think this is not being done in many countries.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, the report is up for anyone to read. It's on the Human Rights Commission's website. It's over 800 pages long. It's really extensive. I mean, I myself, of course, haven't read it cover to cover yet, but I have skimmed it several times to prepare for today's interview. It looks at a really It looks at a very, very kind of extensive and thorough range of things. It looks at, of course, conditions in prisons and so on. But it also really looks at several special categories of prisoners, those who have been arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, prisoners with disabilities, aging prisoners, who are getting old in prison and they are therefore also experiencing all of those issues, people living with HIV, young children, and a whole host of, different kinds of people who are actually confined to our prisons. And it looks again at a number of different kind of angles. It looks at, health conditions, psychological and mental health, and, really a large kind of range of things. So just to get us started, Ambika, is it possible to tell me a little bit about the process? I know it was probably a very long, and we could probably just have a whole discussion just about that. But could
Absolutely.
you just tell our folks here, just in brief, what kind of process did you guys follow to write this report?
Wow. Okay. So, well, it was, initially, of course, we had to get the team together, and that in itself was a bit of a challenge, because we also wanted a team that had, men and women, and it had all ethnic groups. We wanted people with different kinds of, experience. So that took a bit of time, and we didn't wait for the whole team to be constituted. We just started, and then, kept hiring people as we went along to bring people on board. So it was, the process was this. We would go to a prison, and we would spend on average about 5 days in a prison. The first day would always be inspections, which means that we would walk the length and breadth of the prison, inspecting every ward, every cell, the prison hospital, the kitchen, the stores, you name it, every single thing we would inspect. Right. And so then we also take notes. We also took photographs of that. Then on the second day, and sometimes it might spill on to the third day, depending on also how large the prison is, we would administer the questionnaires, right, to the prisoners. And then on the third day, fourth day, we would do interviews with selected prisoners. Now, sometimes depending on the numbers, all these might spill out, spill on to extra days. And then we found when we went to the prisons that many prisoners actually wanted to give us complaints. So then we started allocating 1 day just to sit down and take complaints from prisoners. So we would, even just kind of sit there, about 6, 7 of us. And we would have from morning to evening that, a day or a day and a half, the prisoners would line up and we would write down their complaints. It could be, it would be, things related to medical assistance. It could be instance of violence they experience. It could even be something that, for instance, an arbitrary arrest that took place that landed them in prison. So it was a wide range of issues. So that was basically the process. Then the information that we gathered from this, the quantitative data, we did data processing, and the qualitative data, the interviews that we had. So we administered about 3,000 questionnaires, 200 plus interviews with prisoners, 120 interviews with prison officers. So then we also found—
And how many prisons?
20 prisons. We went to 20 prisons, and we also ensured that we had a good collection of remand prisons, closed prisons, work camps, and also geographically, we wanted to get a good spread. So, yeah.
Of course. Okay.
That was generally the process, simply put.
Yeah. So how long, I mean, just quickly, how long did that take? I mean, how long were you working on this?
Well, actually, I think the visits themselves, it took us about 8 months, I think, or 6 months, the visits. But then we had the work we had to do before, and then the actual writing of all these, writing and editing of the chapters. So in all, I would say nearly 2 years, a year and a half to 2 years.
Right. Got it. And so, I mean, when you started really visiting and then speaking with prisoners and this whole thing, what were some of your impressions about the conditions? I mean, if you could just tell us both your own impressions as well as, you know, what people were saying in interviews.
Okay, but I think firstly I want to say this, and I think this is also probably the experience of many members of the team, is that when I first went into prison, or when we started this study, I also had a very black and white view of it, I now realized. It was not nuanced, it was not complex. In that we thought, yes, prison guards are all terrible, and the prisoners are always being abused, and we had a very black and white. But when we went in is when we began to realize that the entire system is dysfunctional and kind of rotten. Even the people who, end up in prison, for instance, that's why in the report you will see that we started off with the treatment and conditions, but we've gone on to talk about the judicial and legal process, access to legal representation, arrest and detention, because we realize the problem lies, the reason we have problems in the prison is because of the problems we experience outside prison, the entire criminal justice system. That is one thing that we realize. And the second thing is, even with regard to the Department of Prisons, is that, it is, they are not, it's very easy to blame the guards, but they are also victims of the system. That we need to acknowledge. And sometimes they're put in positions where even if you and I were in the same positions, we would have to question ourselves whether we would react the same way or differently. So I think we realize the dysfunctionality of the system is the first thing we realize, and it's not as black and white. And fixing it, there are no overnight fixes. It requires change of systems, processes, and also of culture and values as a society. How we view crime, how we view punishment, all that. So, and the conditions, of course, were quite appalling. So, for instance, one of, I think, the worst prisons that we have seen in terms of overcrowding, in terms of, sanitation, all that would be, I think, the Colombo Remand Prison. That is one of the worst, where, people sleep in the corridors. It is also quite, dirty. You find people even sleeping on ledges in the bathrooms because there isn't space, or people are standing around. And because it's a remand prison, prisoners also don't have anything to do. So the whole day you find people just standing around, which really is, if you're talking about prison being a place where you rehabilitate a person and the person comes out a better person, it is clearly not achieving that objective. Then the other prison, where the conditions were appalling also because of the overcrowding, was Negamba Remand Prison. So there, for instance, when we were just standing, like literally 5 minutes, you stand in a particular ward and you would be drenched in sweat because it is so overcrowded and there is no ventilation and it is quite dark. Now imagine someone living in that place 7 days a week. You think the person's going to come out rehabilitated? And do you think our taxpayer, rupees are being spent as they should? So, and also you would have, for instance, now if you go to Valcada, the buildings are all quite dilapidated. Some of them are even condemned buildings. And you have condemned prisoners living in condemned buildings. When it rains, it just pours through. The condemned prisoners are held in places, in kind of wards which are dark pretty much 24/7. and the walls are cracked. There's like water seepage. The bathrooms are, the toilets are at the end, and anyone in the inhabiting the cells close to that would constantly be kind of flooded. So those generally are, I would say, are general impressions of the conditions.
Right, right. I mean, I saw that also, of course, many months ago when COVID was quite clear to us was going to be, a kind of an ongoing problem, I think, all over the world. I know that many of you, both, who are currently on the Human Rights Commission, but also, those like you who had been there until this year and had, worked on this issue. But also, I think other human rights people and experts on this issue, I think categorically said, like, Sri Lankan prisons are just categorically overcrowded, and this is going to be a problem, right? Send people home. And I think, what we've seen in the last few months is it really just that those kind of cautions coming true, which is terrible, because there is, of course, the feeling that we could have really done something about it before, right? But the state just didn't act. And I saw that you would also, in more recent weeks, tweeted about the conditions that you witnessed when you were putting together the report. And you had said that, even the prisoners said this whole thing around any person that comes into the prison with, within the first week, you fall sick. So it must be quite common for even a regular kind of virus or an illness to spread, right, in these conditions.
Very much so, because the overcrowding is so bad. Because there is no ventilation, because people don't have access to water 24/7. In most prisons, water is pumped in only for an hour or two and at different intervals, maybe twice or maybe 3 times a day. And most of the wards might not have tubs, so then prisoners have to use bottles and buckets to get the water, collect the water when the water comes. So they have to then use that until they can collect it, in the afternoon or in the evening. So in such conditions, it's very, very hard to maintain a sanitary environment. So if one person falls sick, then the likelihood of everyone falling sick is very high. And the conditions are such, it's natural, as I said, within the first week or, within the first few days, you can fall ill.
Right. Do you mind talking a little bit, Ambika, about the kind of gendered impact of these experiences that you witnessed and that people spoke to you about? What is it like for women prisoners? But also, if you could talk a little bit more about what happens to people who are gender non-conforming, like what happens to trans people and so on in these kinds of scenarios.
Yes. Well, one thing in terms of conditions, what we found is that the women's sections were always better than the men's sections. And the only reason for this is why? Main reason, not overcrowded. That's right. The women's sections, they're also smaller. In certain prisons, you would have like 8 people. Right? And so therefore it was easier to also maintain sanitary conditions. So overcrowding, as we see, is a big problem.
Right.
The other thing that we found is that many women were there. And I think the statistics actually says like 62% of the remandees, 24% of convicted females, 71% of females on life sentences, and 11% of women on death row. In our study, the sample in our study, they actually said they were in prison for drug-related offenses. Right. And we often, when we spoke to them, we found that they have been drawn into the drug trade, as it were, because of their male partners. It was husbands, boyfriends, fathers. And what happens is the women get caught. Sometimes the men do not. The women get caught and come to prison, and then they're abandoned. They cannot access legal aid. And then they languish in prison. While they're in prison, they lose control of their children. They don't have access to their children, or they lose custody of the children. And I think what we found is that this was what caused them most anguish, the women. The fact that they are losing contact with their children. And that comes through in the report. In many of the quotes also, you will see that. And the other thing is, of course, in terms of one important thing is that women do not have access to sanitary napkins. That because the department does not have a budget for it. So what happens is that people donate, and to give the department its due, and we must, is that they actually, some of the superintendents make an effort to actually get donations of their
Right.
own
Yeah.
volition. They try
Right.
very hard.
Right. Of course. But the official budget has no allowance for this, basically. So they
No,
have
the
to work
official
with
budget.
extra.
Exactly. So what happens is that now, if you're a Sri Lankan, then you would have family who would, when they visit you, would give you sanitary napkins. But let's say you're a foreign national now, Negombo prison, for instance, there are many women foreign nationals who are in remand, right? So for them, what happens? They have no access. What they do is they perform menial tasks. They might wash the bathroom, wash the clothes for the ward and for the other women. So for that, they would get sanitary napkins. That is how they get access.
From other inmates, fellow inmates. Right.
From fellow inmates who would get it through their family members. So I think that is definitely, and the other main problem is that for women, even for men, the options for rehabilitation, quote unquote, right, is quite limited. And it's not actually rehabilitative. But for women, it's even more so. They would probably get just, your sewing or knitting or handwork or something to that effect, right? So then for them, even if they come up, like let's say you're on life sentences and you're coming up to be assessed by a committee for the commutation of your sentence, when they look at your record, it would be difficult to find like what kind of rehabilitative activities have you participated in, right? So then for that, you might actually not get the required marks or the required, so then you're placed at a disadvantage, women. So those are, I think, some of the main things that we saw. Gender non-conforming. That I think in prison, it would be very difficult. We only came across one person in prison. And that person also told us, for instance, that she would be made to dance or that she would be bullied. And I imagine there might even be far worse forms of violations and violence to which she would have been subjected, but perhaps did not tell us. But that environment is also something that is a hyper-masculine environment where control is maintained mainly through violence or fear of violence and creating fear of violence, right? And where a person is robbed of their dignity. That is how they ensure they can maintain control. So in such an environment, a gender non-conforming person would find it very difficult. It is really not, even in our society, a gender non-conforming person finds it difficult with our values. So imagine in prison with so many more inequalities, that it would, and for the person we found, yes, I mean, we came across, she was bullied. She was subject to indignities, let's say.
And I mean, did you come across any cases where of trans people who were put in the ward of the sex that they were assigned at birth rather than their gender? Were there cases like that? Was that
we did not.
Okay.
We did not, but we did not. But that's, I think, one thing that we really do need to study actively. So I don't know whether we didn't come across it because we didn't actually go looking for it, because in such a context, such a person would not openly come out, because they would also be, be reluctant, be afraid. So maybe we should have made the effort to go look, or to be more vigilant and to be more open to it. So I think that is something that definitely we do need to look into.
There's just a question here, and because we were just talking about women in prison, maybe you could just touch on this now about what happens in relation to pregnancy and childbirth.
Yeah, well, it depends also on the prison, and it depends on the officers, because they are supposed to take these women for prenatal, clinics. And some of them said that they were taken. But of course, there is a problem in taking women, not just women, any prisoners to hospitals, because they have a shortage of officers. They have a shortage of buses, and they prefer to use the officers and the buses to take people to court, because if they don't produce people in court, they can be in contempt. So they're petrified of that. So therefore, yes, it is not the best care. But when you go into labor, you are supposed to be taken to the hospital, and then you're brought back. But the point is, when you're brought back, postnatal care for the child, for yourself, special foods, those are all very difficult to obtain. It is not exactly given by the prison. So unless your family provides that for you, you're not going to have access to it.
Right.
And particularly for women, let's say, who have been abandoned by their families, I think that would be also a very emotionally traumatic experience. So our prisons are really not geared for this. In terms of facilities. And that said, some of the officers do try their best, but the system itself is really not geared for that.
Right, right. And do young children stay with their mothers? I mean, is there some kind of cutoff age or something like
5.
that? How does it work?
Yes, they do. Until the age of 5, they can stay with their mothers. And that is allowed. And although earlier this year, there was a statement made that they were going to reverse that, they did not, thankfully, because we find that even for the children, many of these children don't actually have family that can take care of them. So if they don't have family, even at that young age, they would be sent off to a home. So rather than that, and also they would lose contact with the mother. So I think even for the children that we have seen, they did seem happier to be with the mother. But once again, the problems about when the child falls sick, to be able to take the child to the doctor, you don't have proper access to medical care, special food for the child, that will be difficult. Things like that. But of course, I mean, in Balikada, what we saw also is that due to the personal efforts of one of the commissioners, that they had, constructed through donations a play school, and they had a teacher who would come and actually teach the children. So in a sense, they were trying to create an environment as close as possible to the normal environment for these children to be with their mothers. But it's very difficult for the mothers, because there was a story. I mean, if you look at the report, they say even about, for instance, they get food from, she was trying to make noodles, I think, for which she needed hot water. You can't get hot water there, right? So for that, she had to ask the officer. But then the officer would say, well, you can't just make for your child, you would also have to make for the other child. But she said, I don't have enough for the other child. I have only enough for my child. So you see, simple things like that.
Just everyday things,
little things, but in prison, they become really complex. And also might lead to kind of breakdown of relations between prisoners as well. Because, how do you feed only your child while there is another little child, probably looking at it when you're giving your child a biscuit, little things like that, which can be heartbreaking.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I was really interested in was that you had said in the report that the prison officers, I believe, are sort of asked to do this assessment, like an ongoing assessment of the prisoners, right? Which includes a kind of a mental assessment. And then is there that they have to kind of
recommended that they do that.
Sorry?
We recommended that should be done, because right now that is not done. What we recommended in the report is that it should be done. By law, there is a way to assess prisoners every 4 years. And after that, if you find the person has been rehabilitated, you can actually release the person on license, or you can release the person altogether. But that assessment actually stopped. It's called an evaluation. That's what it's called in the prisons ordinance. But that's stopped mainly because of public uproar, because the public thought, oh my God, all these people are getting out, right? So due to public uproar, they actually stopped that. And but of course the prisons department, so they would also, what the prisons department would do is it would do this evaluation, which it would then also send right up to the president's office. Sometimes, for commuting people who are on long sentences, to 5 years, or to, pardon them and release them. But they would be sending it. But of course, the president's office, the president stopped doing that. That was, I think, during President Chandrika Kumaratunga's time. But of course, the Department of Prisons still keeps doing these evaluations. And they still, sometimes we saw documentation where they even sent it to the president's office. But of course, it is not done officially. but the prisons department is still doing that. So the good news that I have seen recently is that the current, the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Prison Reforms have actually announced that they're going to restart this process of evaluations, which is great because it means that people will get assessed and they can leave prison sooner.
There's grounds for release.
Exactly. But what we have also recommended, I mean, I've also written directly to the officials concerned, you know, referring them to the relevant chapters of the report. And I've said that they must ensure that this process of evaluation is something that is comprehensive, where you also have a psychological evaluation. It's not just where you know, a 2-page report where you write the minimum, but it's a proper assessment, right? Where you can also, because we can learn from other countries, like even the United Kingdom, where they have like a risk assessment, then they have, you know, kind of, rehabilitation plan for the prisoner when the prisoner comes into prison itself. And then every year what you would do is you would assess whether the person has met the milestones, and if not, why, what can be done to help the person. And then if the person is held in like a high security prison and has really kind of met the milestones, then you move the person to a lower security prison. So in a sense, the whole purpose is to help the prisoner find their way out of prison. It is not to keep them locked up for, it's not to keep them, you know, locked up for as long as possible. So I think what they need to do, and for that, of course, if you are going to do something like that, a proper evaluation, you do need to increase the cadre, the number of officers, because the officers now, particularly the rehabilitation officers, they do not have enough officers. They are severely overworked. And therefore, you do need people, and you also need people with specialist skills.
You know? I was just going to say, I mean, you need professionals who have the right training.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you need to give training to the officers there. You need to hire new personnel with the required skills. Only then will you be able to undertake these evaluations properly. So that is a recommendation I think that we have made. And one hopes that the government will take heed.
Right. One of the things that I was quite interested in were the interviews with young people, you know, the YOs, as they're called in the
YOs, yes.
And you know, the kind of severe impact that incarceration has on the mental health of young people. You know, how many of them spoke about, just very frankly about, you know, thinking of killing themselves many times, or even, you know, attempting that. And then, you know, all these different kinds of nuances, right, about the different kinds of stigma. You know, one young person speaks about the kind of how they are, I think he's like perceived to be homosexual, and how that is, you know, that stigma is kind of, clearly kind of being used against him. Could you talk a little bit about, you know, your experience of meeting young people in prison?
Yeah, so then there are, I suppose, two different, one is, of course, they are in prison itself. So that can be the remandees, where you have, for instance, even in Colombo remand prison, or if you go to New Magazine prison in Colombo, you have remandees who are like, you know, 17, 18, even 16 we've come across. The youngest, I think, was 16. And then, of course, you have at the Wateraka training school, as they call it. So there they are sent instead of being in prison.
And that place seems to have a particular reputation.
Exactly, indeed. And I think it's there that we found that young people, once again, you know, many in a cell, they're locked up at 5. So you can imagine, you know, young boys, young kids, how they would feel. Saturday, Sunday, sometimes if they're short of officers, they would lock them up. So they can't go out, they can't get physical exercise. And of course, there, the violence we found was, I mean, it was more than in prisons. I would say that kind of that threat of violence, or that sense that it was a violent environment, you could feel, because also many of these young men have come from difficult backgrounds, or it might be, you know, broken families, and the emotional impact of imprisonment or detention and being separated from the family was that was quite devastating. And we found, you know, many had self-harm and had suicidal thoughts but even to address that, they didn't actually have any assistance, because they had one counselor, and of course the counselor said that she did actually see, that she did counsel these young people, but they of course said that they barely went. They didn't even know that some of them didn't know that she was there, and also they were afraid of reprisals, because they felt if they went and told her about the problems they were experiencing, that somehow that would result in reprisals from the officers. Because even to talk to us, there was a lot of fear. They actually did not want to. And then we had to have kind of focus groups, with rather than one-on-one interviews, because of the deep fear they had that if they spoke to us, they would be punished for it. So I think sending young people to these institutions really robs them of their life chances, and only disadvantages them and marginalizes them further, because many of them, they shouldn't be in such institutions. We should have within community and within society ways to help these people, young people, whether it is psychological, whether it is economic, whether it's in relation to education. Right now, I think our attitude is, he's problematic. He gets angry because one boy, when we asked, said, oh, well, it's there in the report. Well, why were you sent there? Because, I used to get angry all the time, and I would smash things, and I smashed the TV. So you do not send a child to, I would say a child to detention.
Prison.
For prison, for that. You need psychological help, and, so I think our method of dealing young people who are in conflict with the law is only criminalizing them. And I think if, pushing them into criminality. So therefore, I think we should not be surprised if we have young people who would then, start, 2 years later, they might get arrested for dealing in drugs. Right? Because they have no social support, no community support, no family support. So what do you expect them to do? And also the other problem in sending young men to prison is that they become criminalized there. And there are enough stories of that, meeting someone there who tells them of, yes, don't worry about this, I will help you.
When you get out,
when you get out, and then you get drawn into the drug trade, and you might find it difficult to break out for various reasons. And then once again, what do? We criminalize them and we send them to prison. And we think that we will solve social problems through imprisonment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was very interested in what you said about, how before you said the public outrage is the thing that actually brought an end to these evaluations of the prisoners, and I think that goes to what you said right at the beginning, that I think the conditions in prisons as outlined in the report, I think really kind of beg the question about who we are as a society, and what our values are. And I think, of course, in the case of public outrage, that's a very obvious example of the fact that clearly we do uphold values of punishment, where, we do want to send people who sort of don't conform away, right? And that is something that we think as a society is an important and a good response.
Because what we don't seem to realize is that deprivation of liberty is the punishment, you see. But we think going to prison is not enough. You must be subject to terrible conditions within prison. So for instance, when Angulukona Palace, the new prison that was built, they built a swimming pool. And I remember that there was a lot of outrage at the time. My God, why should prisoners have swimming pools, right? The reality is that was actually never for the prisoners, and the prisoners are not using it. It's the officers who use it, and it's also rented out to others. So the prisoners never had access to it. But the whole point is, if you think someone has committed a crime, is a terrible person, you want the person to become better, do you think subjecting the person to terrible conditions, robbing them of their dignity, and sending the message society hates you is going to make them a better person? Not at all. It will make them angrier. So when they come out, you have a broken, angry person, and that is really not good for society. So I think we need to change our thinking about how we deal with crime and punishment. We are a very punitive society, right? And we also don't believe in kind of self-responsibility. So even if we take kind of COVID for now, right? We find that, yes, there are people who are going around living life as if there was no pandemic.
Right.
So then you think, what can we do? We need to.
But then still scolding the government.
them.
Because that's what we are good at, right? It's always kind of palming the blame off rather than just having some kind of collective will about something that we can control.
Absolutely. So then the government, so they say, okay, let's arrest them and let's remand them in the middle of a pandemic and let's fine them. Really, you cannot change behavior in the long run through punitive means, because you can't have punitive means 24/7, 365 days of the week, which means you are going to need people to actually have a sense of civic responsibility and do the right thing. So I think we're focusing and we're putting our budgets into kind of the wrong thing. And now we say that they're going to build some new fancy large prison with the help of China. And that to me is a very frightening thing, because we should not be building new prisons to solve the overcrowding problem. We must figure out how to prevent people from going to prison. So here, for instance, we have a Community Corrections Act, right? Which can be used. So if it's a non-violent, non-serious offense and the punishment is less than 2 years, then instead of being sent to prison, you can be given a community corrections order. We also have a community corrections department, but that is severely, as usual, underfunded, understaffed. And the criminal justice system doesn't actually use community corrections because most of them are not aware of it. And even if they are, they feel like, it's a nuisance, because if you send someone for community corrections, you have to keep their file open for a long time, right? Which means more administrative work. So it is not used.
And more shared responsibility.
No shared responsibility. Send the person to prison, problem over, now we can get on with our lives.
Exactly.
So community corrections actually is something that can be used. Now, if I look at statistics, I think this is actually a very striking number, is that in 2020, there were 29,000, that is in 2019, there were 29,164 persons who were convicted, right? Of that number, 94.1% of persons were convicted by the magistrates court. Now, if it's a magistrates court, that means that the sentence can't be more than for 2 years. If it's not more than 2 years, then you don't need to send the prison. You can actually.
Why is this person going to prison?
So why is 94.1% of 29,164 people in prison? There's absolutely no need, because daily it cost us, like all of us, 645 rupees to maintain a prisoner, which comes to per prisoner about 235,000 rupees. So, into 28,000 prisoners into 1 year. Channel that funds to community corrections.
Absolutely. And I think that is what prison does, isn't it? The whole approach, as you said, not just in the prison, but from before, right? The entire system that exists that then sends the person to prison is really all around absolving ourselves of any responsibility as a society that produces violence, that produces poverty, that pushes people into criminality, all of these things. And it kind of individualizes the wrong, isn't it? It kind of thinks, okay, the evil is somehow embedded in this individual, and therefore the individual must pay in some way.
And that is what we found, in a way, it's like the, I don't know, banality of evil. I don't quite know how to call it, but like I would say we, during our prison visits, have met pretty much nearly all the big names, as it were, even, who are in prison. For all the big names that pretty much, I think, pretty much met all of them. And what comes through in all of them, even in the worst person, is why I would say I'm so against the death penalty, is that in a way it's the humanity that comes through, right? In a sense of, yes, he's a terrible person, has done terrible things, but would you actually want the person to be put to death? Because when they talk to us, you also see the other side of it. That the person it's
just a person.
It's just a person that comes through repeatedly. The other thing is, many of these people, now let's say people on death row, most of them are actually there for murder. They are not there for drugs. right? And of that, you would see about 67% of them, I think, of the general prison population are in prison for the very first time. And many of them are on death row. So many people on death row are not these kind of hardened, terrible criminals. They are people who, like the story that I always tell, of this young boy who was, I think, 17, whose mother and family were being subjected to violence by the uncle. The uncle comes to beat them up one day. To save the mother, he takes Alawango on from the roof, and he just kind of hits the uncle and keeps on hitting him, and he dies. Right? Now he's on death row. So it is people like that. So should they be on death row? I think that is what makes us aware, or should make us aware, that this is about collective social responsibility. Why were they living in such a condition? Why was the woman being subjected to violence and had absolutely no help? Exactly. So those things, and of course our law, we do need to change the law, because right now, if you commit an offense when you're under 18, you can still be sentenced to death if the sentencing happens when you're over 18. So we need to actually, firstly, we just need to abolish the death penalty. Then we wouldn't even have to change that particular law. We just need to abolish the death penalty. Let me say that.
Absolutely. I think we can all, I hope we can all agree on that. I'm sure that folks who have joined us here today will agree on that categorically. Just Ambika, last thing before we kind of get to, your own sort of analysis and how your position, may have changed or shifted throughout this process. I just would like you to talk a little bit about the Prevention of Terrorism Act and political prisoners and how ethnicity plays a role in all of this. Could you just reflect a little bit on that?
Yes, because we interviewed, I think, probably of all the people who are in prison under the PTA, we would have interviewed at least about 75% of them, I think. And what came through is that, once again, we really do need to repeal the PTA is what came through. Because
abolish the death penalty, abolish the Prevention of Terrorism Act.
Because what we found is that many of them were not particularly arrested according to due process. They would have been, they said that they were abducted. The families were not given an arrest receipt. They said that some families didn't even know that they had been arrested for weeks or sometimes even months. They said that they were subjected to torture and also forced to sign confessions, and the confessions were often in Sinhala. They did not understand that. The torture stopped only after they signed the confession, and in some cases, the confession is the only piece of evidence against the person. Now, a good case example is of a prisoner who was a person who was acquitted last year. Now, he was arrested in his 20s, had spent about 12 years in prison. So by the time he leaves, he's like, kind of close to 40, right? And he was acquitted. The only piece of evidence they had was the confession, which was thrown out, and he was acquitted. Now, what does that say? He was acquitted by a court of Sri Lanka, mind you, right? So therefore, for all those people who kind of, are up in arms about this, then are you questioning our judiciary is the question to ask them, right? So our courts acquitted them. Sri Lankan courts acquitted him because they found out that the confession was obtained through torture. This is well established by even our judicial system has found this. And even recently, I heard that another prisoner had his confession thrown out because the court, there was evidence that it was obtained through torture. So I think for these prisoners, they have been in prison for a long period, right? Because I think if we can even quickly go through the data, I think we had people more than 10 years of our sample, we found that 22% of PTA remandees had been in prison for more than 10 years. 29% of male convicted had been in prison for more than 10 years. There was 37% of remandees had been in prison up to 10 years. 46% of male convicted had been in prison up to 10 years. That's a long period of your life. And the problem is also that, trials take a very long time, and then appeals take a very long time. And the problem with this also is access to legal representation, not just in relation to, persons detained under the PTA, but we also found that even in persons on death row, is that many of them could not afford a lawyer, right? So then a lawyer is provided for you during trial. But what happens is that they said, and this also has been, others have also said this, is that many of these lawyers tend to be very young, the state-assigned lawyers. And they also don't show much interest because they don't get paid as much. I think it's like 3,000 rupees, which has now been increased to 8,000 or something now for them, the payment for each appearance. And so therefore, they felt that these people didn't take an interest. And even after you're convicted, let's say you're convicted, if you cannot afford a lawyer to appeal to the Court of Appeal, you're provided a lawyer. But if your conviction is affirmed at the Court of Appeal and you want to appeal to the Supreme Court, you're not given a lawyer. Which means those who cannot afford it haven't actually used the final appeal available to them. So many persons we found on death row had not actually appealed to the Supreme Court because they just couldn't afford it. So these, and also, are these people getting the best defense possible? Are they getting a lawyer who is mounting a vigorous defense? Most often they said, and when going by their narratives, it appeared not. Because of the fact that, they were young, they were inexperienced, etc.
Right. Thanks so much for all of that, information and all your own insights as well. And I think we're just about 6 minutes to 7, so I just want to wrap up. But I think it would be good, because we've, of course, personally one-on-one talked about this, but I think over time, generally feminists in Sri Lanka have of course taken the position to abolish death penalty. I think that has come up several times. Not all, obviously, and I think that's the thing, right? Is that even today, I think there are those who are, defenders of women's human rights who still believe that the death penalty is to be applied in the case of rape and murder and so on and so forth. But I think, with what happened with Krishanti Kumaraswamy, in the 90s, and then Vidya in I think that was 2014.
2014. Yes, I think.
Yeah,
yes,
I think I always think about those two cases, and I kind of think about feminist, discourse about criminal punishment between those two cases. And I do think that many have moved towards a position that says, okay, we have to abolish the death penalty. We can't advocate for that as feminists and so on. Do you think that as feminists, someday we could take a position to abolish prisons in this country? Is that something that you think that we now have enough data to sort of start that conversation?
Absolutely. I would say the prison report actually provides a lot of data for us to start the conversation on abolition, because what we have seen through the data of the prison report is that imprisonment doesn't really seem to work. If at all, it seems to exacerbate the problems that we have. And the number of people who are being imprisoned increases every day. So I think definitely we do need to move towards abolition, because I think the reason we put people in prisons is because we don't want to actually look at ourselves in the mirror. We do not want to acknowledge the deep faults that we have within society. Firstly, we're a very violent society, right? And it's also could be due to the war that in many ways, violence is normalized. And violence doesn't mean killing someone. It doesn't mean even, physically assaulting someone. It's just when you go on the road, just see how someone cuts in front of you, and when you kind of tutor them, the kind of aggressive gesture the person might make, or the obscene language the person uses. So clearly, that is also violence. That is how violence trickles down and is normalized in everyday life, right? So I think that, and also we are a deeply patriarchal society, which is why you get a lot of violence against women, crimes against women. We are a misogynistic society. So unless we actually and sometimes with the intersections of violence, misogyny, patriarchy, oh my God, that is the
of course. Racism, don't forget racism.
Racism, communalism,
we're also a very racist
the intersections.
Society. Yeah.
Absolutely. So therefore, those we do not want to acknowledge. You know, we take what one of our common friends calls as the kumbaya approach, and we say we only look at the good in society, and we are in denial. I think Sri Lanka to be in denial. We like to sweep everything under the carpet, talk about all the great values we have, but we don't actually put that into practice. So I would say that sending people to prisons is really not going to solve our problems. So we do need to start thinking about alternative means. Now, for instance, to say personally the change that I have felt, because people ask me, what would you do? I've had these even conversations with even some members of the team who are here, is that personally, when someone does something, I really hate, or I can't even think about going to the police about that now.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
Yeah.
Because the chances of that person being abused or tortured in the police, that prevents me from using the police as perhaps the first stop. I would think 5 times about that.
Yeah.
So therefore, even in my mind, when I write something and I say we need to hold the people accountable, I feel a bit awkward and odd writing that, because I wonder, how are you going to hold them accountable? Is it only through trials and you send them to prison? But then I feel really awful saying, yes, we send them to prison and that will solve everything. So personally, I am grappling with all this, which is why even when I write, the language I use now has changed, and I try not to use legal languages of, imprisonment, accountability, judicial processes, because yes, we need them, but I feel we do need to reimagine them, because the way they are practiced and implemented now is really not serving a greater social good.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's really a great note to end on, a reminder to all of us, and I kind of always think this and say this whenever I can, that I think as feminists, as activists, feminist activists, I think we ourselves have a lot to answer for, because I do think that women's movements and feminist movements have, over the last, so many decades, sought out criminal justice mechanisms as a response to violence. That we have, advocated for incarceration, that we continue to advocate for sort of stronger punishment. I mean, these are what some consider achievements, right? To say, oh, we changed the law to get more sentencing, mandatory sentencing, longer sentences. I mean, those are unfortunately today still how we're counting our accomplishments. So I do think that we do have to have a long, hard look at our own work and our own strategies, and to sort of, hold ourselves accountable as well. Any last thoughts?
Last thoughts. I mean, I would just also want to say that I think one of the best things about this study, I think, was also for us and for me personally, one is the team. The amazing, I have to say this, the amazing team of young people who worked on it, with whom, many of whom I still have, contact and communication, and who I think their lives were also changed by what they saw in terms of, what they hope to do with their lives as well. And the second thing is, of course, meeting the prisoners and meeting the prison officers. And the final note I want to end is, that was important for us because that helped us see the complexities and the nuances. Therefore, I think, and I say it half jokingly, but also half seriously, is that lawyers, perhaps judicial officers, police officers should all spend a minimum of 24 hours in a prison cell, exactly like a prisoner. I think that will give you a different perspective, because in Japan, before a prison officer begins work, they actually make the prison officers spend a week living like a prisoner under the same conditions. So I believe that people who are part of the criminal justice system, minimum of 24 hours in perhaps one of the worst prisons, so it would be like, Negombo Remand or Colombo Remand prison, or perhaps Valikada, 24 hours in a cell, living exactly, maybe even in Chapel Ward in Valikada, where the death row prisoners are being held. And I think that would help them get a different perspective, because the truth is this: at the end of the day, we really can't say whether you or I might also end up in prison, because when you hear these people's stories, you realize that many of them are victims of circumstances. So
Right.
if we think that we will never end up there, we are only saying it because of the privilege we have. Privilege
Absolutely.
due to ethnicity, privilege due to class and wealth. Right?
Absolutely.
And that is not something that we should use as our justification for keeping all these very dysfunctional and punitive measures in place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us and for having this really honest and kind of really informative and insightful conversation. Thanks to everyone who worked on this really, I think, extremely historic and useful report. I really encourage everyone who joined us here today to just go, and read that report. I do think that it can provide a really strong basis for us to start rethinking some of these really kind of violent structures to which we are all in some way contributing, and we're all complicit, because like Ambika said, it is taxpayer money. We are we're sort of civilians. It is our resources. So I think we should be a little bit more kind of cognizant about what structures are being upheld with our money and in our name, because this is all to protect us and for our safety and so on and so forth. So thanks everyone for joining us, and obviously others can watch this on our Instagram later. It'll of course get recorded there. Thanks again, Ambika.
Thank you, Subha, for asking me. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank
See
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.